Welcome to our series, Is the Book of Mormon an Historical Account of the Lost Tribes of Israel in North America? This is episode 1, introducing me, this project, and the project approach. Is the Book of Mormon an historical account of the lost tribes of Israel in North America? This is going to take a lot of episodes to deal with. And so I want to begin just by introducing myself, then talking a little bit about the project and what we're going to do and the project's approach. I think considering the source is always a great idea when choosing study material. And so I think it's important to start by introducing me. During the course of this work, you will find me regularly introducing and then questioning a variety of sources. In such cases, I'll weigh them against the weight of all other evidence, question motives where there may be a conflict, and even point out internal inconsistencies. At times, you may judge me to be unfair. It's hard sometimes to criticize a large volume of material without appearing so. I hope you also find me doing the same thing, though, for the sources that support my argument. I'm also aware that I'm open to the same kind of engagement. Why would you trust me, a non Mormon, about Mormonism at all? It's pretty clear you deserve to know my background and qualifications and even my motives. My name is Kevin Warren. Until late in my life, you could easily categorize me as the classic case of somebody being blown by every wind of doctrine. That's Ephesians 4:14. I want to mention also when I do Bible references, they will always be from the English Standard Version in the course of this material, unless I say otherwise. So I don't want to keep having to say according to the ESV. I was actually born into the Book of Mormon. At the time of my birth, my family were Bickertonites from Monongahela, Pennsylvania. You don't really need to know much about them to understand the relevancy of this to this work. You should know that Bickertonites deeply believe in Joseph Smith as a true prophet and therefore affirm the Book of Mormon entirely. They just disagreed at the time of Joseph Smith's death that Brigham Young was the right prophet. And then again, they disagreed a little while later with the person that they originally thought was supposed to be the leader, Sidney Rigdon, and chose to follow Bickerton in Monongahela, Pennsylvania. So I have every wind of doctrine roots kind of in my blood. When my father joined the Air Force, we found ourselves transported to places where LDS was prominent, but there were no Bickertonites. We felt unwelcomed in the LDS communities, and we really didn't want to be involved with following anybody that we thought was a false prophet, anyways. Since my family still affirmed Jesus as Lord, I became infused and reinfused into whatever version of Jesus is Lord was dominant in the various communities where I lived. Mostly that was Texas, Colorado, and Arkansas. My personal theology resembled a casserole far more than a simple steak and potatoes meal, to say the least. What I learned from my theological casserole life was to adapt as opposed to taking an attackable position. Thus, I was probably the first Catho, Baptist, Methi, charizologist to ever firmly uphold the Book of Mormon. In fact, back then, if I had to choose one or the other, I would have affirmed the Book of Mormon over the Bible, just because it was so me to do so. I love the idea that my family had a little special Gnostic insight, clearly proven by the fact that our church was named after Jesus. We were the people, quote, called by his name. And both the Bible in Second Chronicles 7:14 and the Book of Mormon in 3 Nephi 27:8 agree that this is a mark of the true church. Forget the fact that the name of God in Chronicles was actually Yahweh, not Jesus, and that all Christians technically bear the name of Christ. Don't get stuck in the details. In fact, believing in the Book of Mormon while not being LDS allowed me to affirm any theological position, I was required to do in order to fit in. And being a military brat, where I moved around a lot, it escalated fitting in to an almost primal need. As a Bickertonite, who could question my beliefs? Does anyone outside Monongahela even know what a Bickertonite is? Now, I know fitting in is a pretty shallow theological reasoning. Don't worry, it gets worse. In the mid 70s, I experienced a major cultural change. My dad was transferred to Madrid, Spain. Up to that point, adapting culturally just meant knowing when to say yuns or y'all, or ain't or isn't, or Coke, soda, or pop. It might mean reflecting in some general sense either liberal or conservative values, or knowing which topics to avoid. And we moved around about every 9 to 18 months. So if you blew it with one crowd, no worries. In a year or so, you would leave and probably never see the offended parties again. I learned how to read people, figure out what they wanted me to be or believe, and then become that. I was effectively a human chameleon. Now, for the first time in my life, due to being shipped overseas, I was going to be in one place for at least 3 years and maybe five. In fact, it played out that we extended twice, so it was 5 years. Imagine never having a home in your own country, never having a church or faith you could attend or worship in your own country, and then suddenly being given 5 years to figure out who you are on your own terms, albeit in a foreign country and culture. I still upheld the Book of Mormon as the inspired word of God theologically, but honestly, in my youth, moving around all that time, I never had time to even read it. I was too busy figuring out who I was, or who I was at least supposed to be, this month. But the idea that if God had lost sheep in North America, that he was going to leave them out of his new covenant, that just didn't make sense to me. It would make sense they would have to go to them. That was my Jesus. I learned a lot in Spain. Mostly, though, I learned how the rest of the world thinks. Americans have a very unique sense of individualism centered on pick yourself up by your bootstraps and make something of yourself thinking. The rest of the world doesn't see life that way. The rest of the world is a shame honor world centered on collectivism. We don't have time to even scratch the surface of that now, but what I need you to know is that the Bible is centered on that exact kind of world, the collective honor shame society. During those years, I learned how I reflected on my people and my community and why that mattered more than whether I was talented, successful, or rich. That was the world of Jesus as well. And it's the world of the Native Americans, as it turns out, too. Yes, I'm acknowledging a similarity between traditional Native American family collective values and Jewish values. Unfortunately, because the values of wrong or right are centered on a different history, the similarity pretty much ends there. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Investigating that is what this work is all about. If I had to score, I'd say I'm pretty qualified to be your tour guide. Certainly, I would submit I'm more qualified than Joseph Smith was. He may have me on the prophet credentials. At least he said he saw an angel. But I have him on understanding biblical shame and honor and collective societies. I lived in one. Returning to the U.S. was a big cultural shock, to be sure. Frankly, it drove me into religion. In Panama City, Florida, you had two options to meet and get to know people, and I was craving cultural communal relationship. So I tried both methods. The first was the party and nightlife community. I was not very competitive there, much to my chagrin. I was successful, though, in the Southern Bible Belt world, the charismatic church world. And since I thought that was where I was going to be, Florida, the rest of my life, and certainly my college years, I began to really question my commitment to the Book of Mormon. I became the best charismatic, name it, claim it, Bible teaching, college age kid I could be. I even learned some canned, easy to remember, off the shelf, tract centered refutations of the Book of Mormon. Eventually, though, name it, claim it proved to be as theologically hollow as Bickertonism without reading the Book of Mormon. For me, that whole line of thinking fell apart once I started to face the real struggles of life and saw God was a little bit more profound than being my personal candy machine ready to meet my every need. That led to a massive crash and burn and moved me into focus on family and secularism. In fact, I became the traditional Americanistic, be the best you can be, Western individualist you can envision. In the process, I lost focus on just about anything but me, and every relationship I had suffered for it. I told you I've been around. Most of the rest of my religious story is far too complicated for this work and frankly, not relevant. I ended up with relationship crisis after relationship crisis until I hated myself and didn't think I held any value at all. To cut the story short, Jesus came into my life, found something worth redeeming, and sent me to a Presbyterian, sola scriptura, Westminster Confession centered, Calvinistic Reformed seminary. That is the process. That's where I learned for the first time who Jesus is and who I was under all those well designed Western American success masks that I'd been using to cover myself up. So, fair warning, yes, I'm biased against the Book of Mormon and particularly LDS, but that's not a reason to put this work down. Socrates would tell us that learning only begins when we understand that we know nothing. And by that, he meant both sides of every argument. But you should also know that I'm not inexperienced with the Book of Mormon, particularly its historical story. I'm not a hater of Mormons or unqualified. I have a BA from Florida State in political science, and I'm a lifelong student of history. I love American history in particular, and I bury myself in it. I also am a student of Koine Greek and Hebrew and a trained exegete of the Bible in both of those languages. I developed that skill and significant understanding of biblical and church history, getting my Master's of Divinity at Metro Baltimore Seminary. I'm also pretty good at speaking Spanish after 5 years living there as a teen. My languages alone qualify me more than Joseph Smith for the matters at hand, let alone my skill in understanding cultures, people, and history. I have specifically invested significant time learning the cultural differences between Gentiles and Palestinians. I say Palestinians here because I've met both Jews and Palestinians in Israel, and Jews are, frankly, actually a minority there. I have made two cultural immersion trips to Israel, one on either side of October 7th attacks, and I spent considerable time in Greece studying the Gentile Jew infusion during the time of Paul. I also studied Paul's historical worldview. If Jews lived in North America before Columbus, we would have signs. And I like to think if I were presented them, I would be qualified to say whether they align with what we should expect given the storyline of the Book of Mormon as described by Joseph Smith. My role in this project will be as your expert witness in all the fields I've suggested my expertise in, and a sort of tour guide. In this work, I will simply present the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith's claims about it, describe what we should see if they are true, show you what we do see, and suggest what that tells us. Your role will be just receiving the content with an open mind and allowing it to introduce internal conflicts if what you thought you knew about the Book of Mormon doesn't match with the evidence. More so, in the next section, I will show you how I intend to contain my bias and use only those skills I feel qualified in as your expert witness. Fair enough? Good to meet you then. Let's get started learning together. Let me begin by introducing this project. This project focuses on a single question. Is the Book of Mormon an accurate historic record of Semitic Jews in the Americas and their encounter with Jesus Christ? That is the scope that I claim to be qualified to testify to as your expert witness, and I'll try not to deviate from them. This is not an attempt to refute every aspect or claim of the Book of Mormon. It is not an attempt to refute the credibility of Joseph Smith as a prophet. In fact, for much of my life, I would have affirmed both the historicity of the Book of Mormon and the credibility of Joseph Smith without question. And even today, both of those claims could be true without any conflict with my other core beliefs or practices. How so? Because it's entirely possible for the Book of Mormon to reflect accurate history of a Native American tribe whose heritage is Semitic without accepting Mormonism or Smith's prophethood. Joseph Smith was a known treasure hunter. To my present knowledge, the only thing of significant financial or historic value he ever found treasure hunting were the golden plates he claims to have translated the Book of Mormon from. Given a lifetime of hunting, it would seem logical to conclude that he did in fact find something, and it was indeed historic. It is even possible that Joseph managed somehow to translate it. Maybe it was written in Iroquoian, and Joseph had an Iroquoian friend who told him what it said. Finding an historic record doesn't make you a prophet. Demonstrating the Book of Mormon's historicity doesn't mean the writing came from God. In fact, we don't even know if everything Joseph Smith wrote even came exclusively from whatever he found, assuming he found anything. It is possible Joseph Smith gained access to some real historical information of Jews in America and then made up additional claims to support a prophet legend. Attaching the book to history in no way requires me to believe anything Joseph Smith claims or accept all the doctrines of the LDS Church. If I claimed the history were true, but the theology was made up, how could you refute me? Do you have the gold plates for us to evaluate and make such a determination? Sadly, no. And frankly, I find that suspicious enough as a historian. In fact, most of the LDS doctrines Christians disagree with are derived from later revelations, like the Book of Mormon and the Doctrines of Covenant. Anyway, I could even completely accept the Book of Mormon as inspired and not affirm LDS beliefs. Indeed, many LDS splinter groups completely trust the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith as a true prophet, but do not believe all of what LDS does. In fact, the variation my family joined did exactly that. The Encyclopedia of Mormonism claims that the first split happened within a year of the Book of Mormon being published, when a group claimed that Joseph Smith had already fallen. In other words, that group could easily claim he fell while writing the Book of Mormon itself, thus accepting only parts of it. Slide the point of his falling chronologically just a little earlier, and we can reject any amount of the Book of Mormon while still completely affirming its general history. I have no bias against finding it historical. And there is reason to think parts of the Book of Mormon were written to support Joseph's polygamous drives, thus allowing us to dispute parts of the Book of Mormon while affirming its historicity. Indeed, The University of Virginia presents a plausible argument that parts of the Book of Mormon itself already laid the foundation for multiple wives, providing that God commanded it and that Smith approved the individual cases. In fact, some scholars claim Smith transcribed a revelation on July 17th, 1831, recommending polygamy and basing it on the Book of Mormon published just a year before. The claim is supported by a letter written just 3 years later to Brigham Young in the wake of splinter groups already moving away from Smith over that very issue. The key portion of the revelation proclaims, quote, "It is Jesus Christ's will that in time ye should take unto you wives of the Lamanites and Nephites," those are Native Americans, "and their posterity might become white and delightsome and just, for even now their females are more virtuous than the Gentiles," unquote. The groundwork for desiring Nephites and Lamanites becoming purified is laid in 2 Nephi 36, which originally read, "Many generations shall not pass away among them, save they shall be a, quote, white and delightsome people," unquote. In the article, "What Does White and Delightsome Mean in the Scriptures?" by the Book of Mormon Central, we are advised the words of that passage were changed to pure and delightsome in 1981, albeit based partly on a note from Joseph Smith, supposedly in the 1840 edition. But it would be easy to make a case that Joseph had designs on encouraging polygamy, possibly with racist motivations, even while writing the Book of Mormon. Thus, it would be perfectly Mormon of me to claim all of the history in the Book of Mormon and still reject any part of LDS or Joseph Smith theology as uninspired. Such is the problem of a religion based on ongoing revelation. And I'm not saying this again to make Joseph Smith look bad. I'm not even suggesting these things are true. I'm just saying there's lots of ways in which I could say the book is historical, but not divine revelation or only partly divine revelation. Again, my purpose is not to defame the Book of Mormon or Joseph Smith here. I'm simply saying my opinions about him personally and the book as inspiration do not limit my objectivity in researching the historicity of the storyline. If anything, I have a bias towards finding the book at least partly historically accurate. That result would be quite useful for me. I am a firm Christian Zionist. If some of the 10 tribes of Israel, lost when the northern kingdom fell, made it to North America and provided irrefutable historic evidence of their history, I would be able to make several claims. To name a few, Israel existed, and archaeology and historic documents on 2 continents prove it. Second, the Davidic claims to Israel and Jerusalem would be reaffirmed by a new source. Third, the Bible would be affirmed as an historical record even further. Fourth, if we could authenticate records of Jesus speaking in the Americas, we'd have proof of his divine nature and historicity. Next, there would be an American connection to the Zionist story. It would make my job a lot easier. Either you or I might be Jewish, just as Joseph Smith claimed he was. In short, Zionism and Christianity would have a much improved position in history if I could affirm enough of the Book of Mormon as historical to place Israelites and Jesus in the Americas between the fall of the Northern Kingdom and the 2nd century AD. Let's talk a little bit about the Mormon LDS missionary experience. If an LDS missionary were to visit you today, their mission would be to get you to read the Book of Mormon. They would tell you it's accurate history. They would say it's another testimony to the same gospel. They would ask you to pray and ask God about it as you read to see if you get a good feeling that it's true. And if you got a good feeling about the book, then they would encourage you to receive it as accurate history. Once you did, it would be natural to get baptized into the LDS since it means the LDS is the one true church. Now, my description above might sound biased from the start, and I'm not claiming that all Mormon missionaries always do it this way. In fact, I'll admit that this is a second-hand report. Though I live in a county where LDS membership represents 20% of the population, second in size only to Catholics, I can honestly say I've never been visited by Mormons at my home trying to evangelize me. So, how can I tell you what a Mormon missionary might tell you? I'm actually paraphrasing the experience from Sister Alyssa Grenfell, a former LDS member and mission trainer. Ah, you might exclaim, she's biased because she's an ex Mormon. And my response would be yes, in some ways she is. But she is also qualified, having helped teach and even design parts of what is done by LDS missionaries. Alyssa says her job at the Mormon Training Center was to, quote, help missionaries transform, unquote, from, quote, civilian life into the missionaries the church wanted them to be, unquote. Their approach, she claims, is heavily controlled and scripted as to what topics to discuss and avoid, and the end goal is clearly stated and managed. In addition, she is quite compassionate towards missionaries, even describing them as abused teens. She makes her claims under pretty constant attack from LDS members and fully aware that some of those that she has worked with on her podcast have already been sued by the LDS Church. Yet she continues to stand by her position about the missionary training. So, on the issue at hand, what Mormon missionaries are trained to say and do, I find her testimony credible. And that's why I present it to you. So, what's the point? I'm simply encouraging a better way of study and research with a more balanced playing field than the ground rules LDS missionaries might propose. You should expect that. Understanding source vetting, as I just demonstrated above in my citing of Sister Grenfell, is not only valid, it's important. That's why I discussed my own biases earlier. Citations are important too. You deserve to be able to know what sources anyone making a claim uses in order to vet their use of those sources. For example, I'm posting a link in the details of this video to a written copy of the white paper I wrote and used as my script here. In the endnotes there, you will find references to all my sources, including a link to Sister Grenfell's video that I used here. It's actually quite entertaining, and I encourage you to watch it. If you wanted, you could actually verify my use of her as consistent with her own claims. In addition, you might note after research that I'm citing a non Christian source. Thus, you could conclude that while the source I use is biased against LDS, she is equally biased against my own faith and qualified on the topic I cite her for. Thus, a credible expert witness in context. I'm not presenting her feelings about LDS or their missionaries. I'm citing her knowledge of what they are taught to say and do. I'm using a balanced playing field. My goal is to be heard, whether it changes your opinion or not. If you do not trust me or trust that I'm being honest with my sources, pretty soon your eyes will glass over, you'll put this work down, unless it agrees with your point of view already, and then it's kind of meaningless anyway. Feelings, the witnesses being called by LDS missionaries when in Christian homes, are not balanced or trustworthy. They simply affirm your own internal biases. I totally encourage you, if asked to do so, to read the Book of Mormon. And I would always ask you to pray for God to help see his truth in anything you read. But I would never ask you to read any book, including the Bible, without applying reasonable, scholarly analysis about its claims. We are also going to fully engage our sources in this project, meaning that we will be citing people who disagree with us and even engaging them on the ways that they do. I'm about to give you an example. Lissa, for example, suggests in her videos to be nice to LDS missionaries. She suggests to offer them friendship, home cooked food, rather than cause them to question their faith. I agree it's important to be nice to everyone, but I cannot agree on not engaging them. Sister Grenfell bases her argument on the fact that the teens are under tremendous pressure, and I agree that they probably are. They are without family or support during that time, and they often already want to leave the mission by the time they come to your house. Their schedule and restrictions on whom they can communicate with and how to communicate is isolationist and abusive. And that's my summary of what I think Sister Grenfell would agree to. Based on her description, it's even maybe cultish. She adds that the shame and abuse missionaries can get when leaving the mission early can be devastating in lifelong ways to them and their families. So she suggests not encouraging them to examine their faith. Sister Grenfell can have that position because she presents herself as a non believer in any faith, at least at this point in her life, as I understand her. My critique is that she lacks a full perspective on the damage being done to these teens. It is, from an eternity perspective, far more abusive to not address their LDS beliefs than to do so winsomely. They are, perhaps for the first time in their life, experiencing what I think Alyssa describes as cultish abuse. That's my summary of it. What a better time to show someone that you care about their eternal condition sincerely. If we walk away from this chance to rightly love them back to Jesus, are we likely to ever get another? And remember, they came to you. They are in your home. With respect to Sister Grenfell, if you are a Christian, I would argue engaging LDS missionaries lovingly towards the truth is our duty, even though it may bring them temporary internal struggle. Cults, if we agree they are so, need to be confronted precisely because their members are being abused, and it is never abusive to kindly and respectfully point that out. I would simply say things like, in my research, I found fill in the blank, and here is my source, insert your source. If that is true, I know the LDS claim that, insert the claim they just made, is not historically accurate. So I appreciate you, but I cannot agree with that position. Unquote. By the way, if you'd like to be competent at doing that and want somebody to teach you how, you've come to the right place. Stay tuned. Before I get to the list of Book of Mormon assertions we will be dealing with, let me give you an illustration that might help understand what I mean by applying a level playing field rightly. My first assignment in seminary was to read the entire Old Testament. The challenge was to comprehend it sufficiently to be able to discuss how the sections we were dealing with in class each week were about Christ, how they were Christological. Uh, to say that that was intimidating for somebody who never read the entirety of a single book of the Bible, let alone each book cover to cover, is an understatement. It was not just the size of the content, it was that it was written to and about cultures very different than mine. Kind of started that whole cultural investigation journey improper after that. I had to remove myself entirely from the story and understand the book's claim of dual authorship, men writing what God gave them. In the process, I could see two distinct stories being told. One was clearly deeply rooted in the history of an historic, real people designed to teach all humans who we are as a species by nature. And the picture was emotionally hard to look at. It included abuse of every nature and every means, even from the men honored as prophets. The second story was God revealing his nature to us because he knew our problem patiently and lovingly. We were designed to be like him, but our rebellious nature makes it nearly impossible to do on our own. In fact, I'd say it does make it impossible to do on our own. That story, the second one, is the story of a creator God being patient, like a patient father, to a species of, well, evil brats. At the same time, I began to watch a TV series that frankly seemed to capture very nearly the same story without the part about a clear, singular, patient Father God who created everything. The series was called The Game of Thrones. While I cannot condone its violence and overt sexuality, the series was a very good tool to help me process what I was reading in the Bible. It's the same story without God intervening to save people based on his love for them. But from a scholarly standpoint, I knew instinctively that the Game of Thrones was not like the Bible. The Game of Thrones was in the genre of fiction. Now, every good work of fiction begins with a great, fully developed backstory to make it seem real. If you got the books, Game of Thrones looks in every way as real and authoritative. It has maps of the seven kingdoms. You can find detailed information about the different religions and the family history. There's a long backstory of how we got to the starting point in the book in history, and that backstory is referred to constantly to make it feel real and understood by everybody in the book. People behaved in character and consistent with their motives based on that background. And it all made sense and was presented as very real. In fact, from an emotional standpoint, when a character rose to near the top of the pecking order, who I thought had the right stuff to restore justice and peace, I wanted the story to be real. And there was almost always one or two characters to root for in that position. If you had to ask me to trust my feelings about the Game of Thrones as a means of deciding if it was real, I would have been telling everybody, winter's coming. I loved it, but I knew it wasn't real. So I treated the story differently. And it was more than the fact that you can get the book in the fiction section and the TV series is not called a documentary. I knew the maps didn't reflect real locations. I knew the people were not recorded anywhere in history. I knew that the religions and beliefs were all drawn from collections of pagan beliefs. I knew winter came not once every 100 years, but every year. And I knew when it did come that winter never brought walking dead people. I knew that nobody ever found a petrified egg and hatched it using fire to make a dragon. In fact, I knew dragons were fantasy. When a book actually claims to be history, we should expect to be able to test it the same way. Our feelings about the book really shouldn't get in the way of us assessing historicity at all. Nonetheless, if you insist on confusing feelings with evidence as we go on, ask yourself this. Does this story feel more like entertainment like the Game of Thrones, or does it look, based on the evidence, like it really happened? And to help, I will be sharing the evidence of other similar finds about other things we know are historical so that you can ask yourself if your feelings align with the facts we're revealing. We're going to go to a slideshow here. You're probably tired of looking at my face anyway, but I think also having a slideshow is going to help this because we're going to start getting into some technical things. The discussion of how we're going to do this, what our methodology is for discussing the Book of Mormon's historicity, is critical. If I was going to invest any more time than you already have in listening to me, I'd want to make sure I knew going into it that the methods I'm going to use aren't just the same sort of rumor mill things that we see in so many podcasts, that it's actually being done in a consistent, scholarly, methodological method that was determined before we actually went into the materials and made our judgment. And that's what we're going to do. So you're going to find that the white paper has my teaching talking points in this. It's way more detailed than what you see on the slideshow. Uh, the slideshow is an overview just to help you understand where we're at in discussing things, to give you something visual to compare. I recommend you look at the white paper because it's going to have all the sources. The sources that are you're going to see in the slideshow or anything that's quoted, I'll make sure that I tell you where I got it from so you know it's not my opinion. Again, this is all about making sure that you trust what's being shared and that it's heard, whether you believe it or not, that at least it's received and heard as being an honest attempt. So let's go through this and see. Let's begin by trying to understand what the Book of Mormon itself claims to be. You can see, look at the bottom. This is from an overview of the Book of Mormon. It's from the Book of Mormon resource manual. You can actually get the link again in the white paper. It's off of churchofjesuschrist.org. So it's an authentic source. They say, the LDS Church says, that the Book of Mormon is a record of three groups of people that were led by the Lord to the American continent, their promised land. It goes on to explain that the three groups are one that came during the Tower of Babel period, another when they were coming to avoid their language being confused, they were actually speaking a something called Reformed Egyptian that the Book of Mormon talks about a lot. That comes from a Joseph Smith claim. One tribe came much later during the reign of Zedekiah, meaning the time of the fall of the northern kingdom. This is where the lost tribes theory comes in. The lost tribes is a theory that when God dispersed all of his people to Assyria, we lose some historical track of them, at least by specific tribe name. And so, how do we uh, deal with that, given that God promised his new covenant to his people, and that would have included all 12 tribes? And so, there's this theory that some of them got lost, and the Book of Mormon, writing off of that, it was a common theory in the time of Joseph Smith that the Book of Mormon rides off of that and says, well, one or actually two of them from that period came to North America. The second one is a group that actually includes a son of Zedekiah. This is the defeated king of Israel, and that he arrives shortly after the first group. So we see that these are actual people in history. And then the Book of Mormon doubles down on that by saying that the Book of Mormon depicts the struggles of these people. This is from the LDS, and testifies of their role of Jesus Christ and his gospel in their temporal welfare and spiritual salvation. These are real. It's something in time. It's a testimony, an actual truth about them, and it's real people. And we're going to see that the LDS Church bases its whole existence on this fact that the Book of Mormon is true history. We're going to get this again from a site. It's something that President Ezra Taft Benson said. It's documented on the Indie Mormon site, the page that talks about Jeffrey R. Holland. Jeffrey is actually quoting Ezra Taft on that page. It's found on indiemormon.com. Again, the link is in the white page. This is what it claims. Quote, the Book of Mormon, this is Ezra talking, the Book of Mormon is the keystone of our testimony. Just as the arch crumbles if a keystone is removed, so does all the church stand or fall on the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon. And I want to emphasize here, there's nothing about feelings in this. He's literally saying, this is the president of LDS, that it is the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon that supports the entire church, and without it, everything false. So this idea of Book of Mormon historicity is central. So let's talk about the methodology. We're going to begin by assessing the actual claims of the Book of Mormon. If somebody makes a statement that the Book of Mormon says something, we're going to actually give you the reference. We're going to show you what it says, allow you to decide whether or not it's actually a claim of history or some other genre of writing. That's one of the things that we do in exegesis is look at the genre of writing. I'll give you an example. Some people would say that the Book of Jonah is literature. The second chapter certainly has elements that would suggest that maybe it is. Some people would say, well, it's a mixture of literature and history, that Jonah in the whale was actually a true story. And we see that Jesus actually cites it that way. His death and resurrection are not a myth. LDS would say that as well. They really happened. And so he's actually using, in when he mentions it, that just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days, so I must be, buried for 3 days and then rise. And so we should read the Book of Jonah that way as a resurrection story. And so parts of it appear to be history, and parts of it might be literature indicating that resurrection. That would be a good exegetical, sound way to look at it. People would argue that, but we're going to use those sort of exegetical tools. What type of literature is this? And make a determination. I also want to say that there's a challenge here when we look at the burden of proof that each item actually needs to have that's a claim in the Book of Mormon. For example, the Book of Mormon claims that things existed. We call these anachronisms that our history of the rest of the world says didn't exist or didn't exist in the Americas. And so we could easily just see that one happened and make the claim, well, steel didn't happen until much later in Europe and the rest of the world. So this is an historical anachronism. We're not going to do that. That's dismissive. We're going to actually look if the Book of Mormon is true and those things did exist in that time, what would we expect to see? So, for example, for steel, we should see evidence of ability to smelt. We should see physical steel things that we can date back to that time. You can't date metal, but you can date the shafts and stuff from arrows. If there's a claim of armor, we should see that. If there's a claim of whatever, we should be able to see it. I want to mention also, this is a good example, I think. I just got back from Leavenworth, Washington. I may include parts of this in an interview on one of our episodes, but the museum curator and her replacement, who's learning to take over, talked to me a bit about how functional things like nutcrackers, the whole museum is nutcrackers through history, how art originally was on functional things like nutcrackers. The reason is because there wasn't a lot of free time, and so you would have to put your art on things like that, either in a storytelling thing on a cave wall, for example, or any functional thing you're going to carry around. So when you look at nutcrackers, you can actually see uh, what types of animals existed in their world, what types of mythical animals they believed in. You can even see from these nutcrackers the types and size of nuts to some degree that would have been in their diet based on the size of the hole or the a divot created to crack a nut in. For example, one of the oldest ones is a Roman nutcracker that shows lions on it. And from that, we can conclude that in the Roman Empire, there were lions. They had encountered them. And we see in the Bible that, in fact, lions are mentioned. And so we can reasonably conclude that they did exist in the Middle East. Um, that's the kind of thing that we'll be doing from an evidence standpoint with the Book of Mormon. Now, we're going to give these things fair consideration. If, for example, an anachronism is claimed in the Book of Mormon, we'll look at the materials. Do those materials, were they something that should last? Is it possible when they talk about armor that they're talking about only leather or material types of armor? And if that's the case, those may not exist. But maybe there should be other proofs of them. Maybe there should be drawings or something that shows them using them. And we have to understand that sometimes drawings are hard to interpret and we can put our own interpretations into them too. So we're going to try to be fair about all that and present what we believe and also what other experts believe. We're going to be very careful about the way we exegete and read scripture using the good and necessary standard, also the literary type standard, every other exegetical standard. But I wanted to talk about good and necessary. Um, Good comes from the idea that we know that the Bible is written for God to reveal his nature to mankind. And so, given that it's that, we cannot assess that anything that God does or anything that the Bible talks about is necessarily saying that God is bad or doing anything that's bad or that we should reach any conclusions about the goodness or badness, because this is the person or the being that is the standard for good and bad. And if God does something, it is for a reason, and we should research it from that angle. Likewise, we have to understand, and I just want to mention this as an aside, we'll go on to necessary in a second, that just because you prove that an aspect of the book is true doesn't mean that the entirety of the book, or even the entirety of one book within the book, is historical. It just means, yeah, it could be history. So we're going to be very careful about those kinds of things at all when we're looking at genre. When you get to the necessary part of good and necessary as a standard, we have to ask the question, we're asking ourselves the question, is my conclusion about this passage in context with the entirety of the rest of the Bible and this story? Or am I putting my own human desires? Am I doing what we call eisegesis, letting my understanding of what I wanted to say get in the way? This avoids scripture mining, which is building an entire conclusion about who God is on a single verse without looking how the Bible uses those same terms elsewhere in the Bible or other things that it says about God that we need to balance across against it. We need to remember that this is God's nature being revealed. And we honestly are never going to get our hands completely around God's nature. But we need to harmonize what he's saying in order to get the best idea of what he means throughout the Bible. Don't scripture mine. So it places understanding God and what I feel about God as two separate things and makes the goal understanding. Therefore, harmonizing is what we do. Let me give you an example. There are some that would say that the reference to Jesus being the firstborn of all creation means that his father must have created him. At some point, he didn't exist and he was born, just like the rest of us are born. The error in this is that the conclusion is not a necessary one when we look at all the other ways this concept is used. For example, David in Psalms 89:27 is called the firstborn of kings. Um, uh, but David is actually, we know, the youngest child. 1 Samuel 17:14 says that. And he's not even the first king. So it's not a chronological statement or a statement even of his birth. In First Samuel 10:17 through 24, we see that Saul was the first king. And so we have to include that this might mean something else. The Bible also claims, in conflict with the idea that he was born, in John 1:1 through 3, that he was there in the beginning and that he created all things that were created, and nothing that was created except through him. That's John 1:1 through 3. So we cannot accept that he was born. He's clearly saying and doubling down on it and emphasizing it in John that that's not the case. And so we have to find a way to harmonize these. It would be illogical to include also that if Jesus created all things and Jesus is a created things, that's what being born means, that Jesus created himself. So both statements, both conclusions cannot be fully true. And then when we look at what David has said, we can easily see that the idea of firstborn of all creation is similar to firstborn of all kings. It is a title or an honorary statement, not a statement of historic fact. So if we encounter similar things in the Book of Mormon and the Bible, we're going to use the same good and necessary standard to see if they are actually claiming what is being claimed about them or if it's about something else. We are going to be fair. The third step is to devise investigative questions to test each burden. We've established the claims, we've determined what the burden of proof is, whether or not it actually says that, and then we're going to devise and investigate questions to each burden. For example, is the claim an actual historical claim? We talked about that. Or is it some other type of literature? Uh, does the word necessarily mean literally what we think, or are we actually maybe saying something else? Um, we see this when we get to some of the animals where they say, well, maybe Joseph Smith just saw it as a horse, but it wasn't really. We're going to use Joseph Smith's ideas, though. We'll explain that in just a minute. And then we're going to use uh, date comparisons on the evidence that we have for other things, and try to answer the question, if we don't have that evidence in the Book of Mormon, why is that? Or is it just not true, not historical? And we're going to kind of look specifically at Joseph Smith's terms about this. We're going to avoid running arguments. And here's what I mean by that. At one point in time, Joseph Smith and the early church said that the people in the Book of Mormon were the principal Native Americans. Most Native Americans came from them. Later on, the church changes that and says that it is the principle of a single tribe or something like that. They modify the position to say maybe these were not a major people. And that's because the evidence began to say, nah, some of what you're saying can't be true. We're not going to do a running investigation. I'm not here trying to defend everything that the LDS Church ever said. We're just saying, since Joseph Smith is the original receiver of the Book of Mormon, if in fact he's a prophet and he's trustworthy, he should have a good idea of what these texts meant as they were revealed to him. So we're going to use his standard. If you want to say that we're not being fair with that, I get it. You can certainly take the LDS's new position, but then that's kind of outside the scope of this. We just want to find out if Joseph Smith is was really given this from God and it is historical, then he should know what it is that was revealed to him. And we also see that in the Bible, we actually have a standard that tells us to do that. Deuteronomy 18:20 through 22 has a test for measuring prophets. It says, but the prophet who assumes to speak in my name, that I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that same prophet shall die. And then it says, and if you say in your heart, how may we know what the Lord has not spoken? Uh, it says, when the prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the word does not come to pass, or hasn't come to pass, or come true, then that is the word. That is the word that the Lord has not spoken. In other words, God will never tell you something that doesn't come true or that isn't true. And so we should have to see that indeed this whole case, the case of whether Joseph Smith ever received anything, rests on his ability to defend his understanding of what the Book of Mormon says. It rests on that. And we're going to use that standard. We're going to limit our investigation to the Joseph Smith interpretation. We may talk about some of the other things just to deal with them, but our focus is going to be on that. And then we see that the fourth thing we're going to do is play each question out using the pattern, this methodology, to the degree that it can be done or is appropriate for the question. We're not going to put things to a test that don't seem right for that. So the next steps we're going to do are to actually start doing step one, assessing the claims of the Book of Mormon. This should be pretty fun. We're going to look at what people have said about the Book of Mormon and what it claims, look at those scriptures and find out if it really does claim that, and then talk about the things that we're going to pull out from that and investigate historically, so that the big picture should start to become very, very clear on this. So I hope you stay with us. I hope you're interested in this and it's exciting to you. I'm going to find it interesting. And to be quite honest with you, I have an idea of how things might play out. I'm going to move away from my biases on those and try to deal with them based on the wholeness of the picture. Uh, I hope to see you next episode. And thank you for taking your time to listen to this.